The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
Okay, but there are more reasons why this works than just the fact that there is knowledge in the head. First of all, constraints are in effect, which means there are often physical constraints that limit the actions that are possible. For example, let's say you get your toaster is broken, you look at it, you will very quickly see what kind of things can I even move or combine or manipulate, and how can I change them when I want to try to unjam my toaster. So constraints that are in effect will immediately tell you, what's left as actions that you can do. So in a way, constraints also encode knowledge in the world because they close some doors so that you'd walk down the right path. Physical constraints in this case, but also cultural constraints. So for example, like you were mentioning earlier, when you have social rules that you've learned in one cultural context and you apply them, then we don't have to think about these again. They apply in many different situations. Example, what to do upon entering a restaurant, right? But that's also an example of cultural differences, of course. For example, you'll see, there's two interesting observations. You'll often see Germans sitting in an American restaurant at a table and looking, why aren't we being served? Because they just walked in and sat down at a table and ignored the little sign that said, please wait to be seated. So they messed up, how the waiters manage their tables and make sure that there's always some space somewhere. And on the other hand, you'll find, these starved American tourists standing at the entrance door of German restaurants waiting for somebody to come and greet them and lead them to a table, because that's not going to happen, in Germany. So those cultural differences are interesting, and then you'll see people will be at a loss and not be able to use that learned knowledge if they move to a different cultural context. More examples. If you take traveling poets, back in the days, Middle Ages, they were able to recite poems of thousands of lines. Thousands of lines. Don't worry, we're not going to make it an assignment to learn a poem with thousands of lines and recite it for the midterm, or maybe we should. Maybe that's a good, I don't know. But how did these people do it? It wasn't that they were learning 1,000 lines of gibberish, of text that didn't make any sense. There are a couple things in there, constraints if you like, that help them learn that. First of all, rhyming. If I know that my first line of the poem ends with the word, I don't know, brave, then there's going to be some other word that will rhyme with brave that will come at the end of the second line. So that's essentially constrained that I know. I need to know this once, and then the rhyming verses will be much easier to learn already because I know it's got a rhyme at the end. And of course, what I'm talking about, hopefully in the poem, isn't completely bogus and doesn't make any sense. It's a story that's being told, at least in those kinds of days. And that also, of course, helps as if you want a semantic constraint, right? So if your first line is about a knight in shining armor, then the next one is probably not going to be about something entirely different, but probably going to continue the story of this guy. So in a way, constraints limit the amount of knowledge that you need to learn, and we can reduce the amount of knowledge, the precision of knowledge, the depth of knowledge that we actually remember by using those constraints. In fact, people often use that to help themselves. So if you arrange stuff on your desk in a particular way and all the ingoing mail is going to be over here, and I'm always going to put my, the cases that I'm working on here in alphabetical order on this desk, then you can use those constraints as long as you stick to them, and you don't need to remember where you place the file Miller, because Miller will be right there in the alphabetical order. So you're using constraints, order in your environment yourself in order to keep yourself from having to remember where everything is. It's very easy that way. And there have been stories of people who have worked in office contexts for decades until somebody realized that they couldn't read. which is surprising in an office context. But basically, whenever somebody handed them a file, they'd like, here's the Miller file, and they'd like, yeah, thank you. And they would put it in the top left corner, and then somebody came back and said, okay, Miller file, top left corner. So they were able to use these constraints, these arrangements, in order to overcome shortcomings in terms of what they were able to, for example, read. What do you think? What kind of knowledge are people using when they're typing? When they're a beginner versus when they become an expert? Yes?
As a beginner, we see at the layout, at labels on the keys we type. As an expert, we know already the keyboard, so we don't have to look at the keyboard, but we can look at the screen and type more quickly.
Right. So it's moving from knowledge in the world to a knowledge in the head process, right? The beginner will basically use the knowledge in the world, the labeling on the keyboard, just like you said. The intermediate will sort of start moving to some knowledge in the head. For example, important keys like the return key, the spacebar, we will know by heart at this point. But we will still use knowledge in the world. We will peripherally look at the keys occasionally and type on them. And that's where most of us basically end up. And then experts, if you ever watched like a professional typist who learned this, it's pretty amazing because they can like really rattle it off very quickly. All the knowledge is in the head. They don't need any eye contact to the keyboard anymore. They completely work without looking at it. Now, of course, this is a trade-off question, right? We would all be faster in typing if we were at this expert level. In fact, my own computer science professor in the first year of my computer science studies in Karlsruhe said, first thing you do when you have a software team, developer team, to make them more productive, send them to a typing class. Because there are still developers out there who type like this, and that's like terribly slow and very expensive because developers cost a lot of money. So it makes sense for all of us to be expert typists, but everybody at some point reaches a certain state where they're like, that's enough for me, fast enough for me. I don't need to type any faster. I don't feel I need to type any faster. And at that point, you basically stop learning more about it, right? And then you type with your 3/4 blind typing exercise. That was literally my first exercise that I got in my computer science studies was, here's a sentence, it was some random sentence about computer science, type it, and if it takes longer than 25 seconds, take a typing class. So I recommend go online, find one of those typing speed measurement tools and see how fast you type and how you perform with your buddies. It's very interesting to see where you stand because you might actually be wasting a lot of time. But that's not the point here. The point is we use knowledge in the world in the beginner level and knowledge in the head as the expert. Another example, here's another little exercise, and that will take a little longer now. I would like you to write down exactly how to get from this building here to the main university building. Okay, you got 5 minutes. Try to write it down. You can do this in pairs and try to think about where you need to go. And just make a list of instructions. We don't need a precise, we're not going to go through like what's the actual rundown. As you did this, you probably noticed maybe by talking to your buddy next to you, that we tend to omit things when we do this, right? So again, you have an idea how to get to the main building. I trust you can all get there. I'm pretty confident that you can. But probably nobody could draw a precise sort of to scale map of, it's like this many meters to the right, and then you make a turn and this. Oftentimes when people do these kinds of instructions, they forget about part of the route. Like, oh yeah, there was another turn, but I forgot about this. Or I have to cross this, road, but I didn't mention it. So the point of this is like nobody of us has a perfect map of, streets or buildings in our head. Oftentimes we forget entire parts of it. Nevertheless, we can get from A to B safely. And why is that the case? Why do we not, have Aachen filled with students who are lost walking around, except in, Newcomers Week in October? Because there's signage out there. And signage is knowledge in the world, right? Signage is something that you don't need to remember. You can just look at the sign. Plus, there's, of course, constraints. For example, street numbers are arranged in a way that is constrained. So if you're looking for a number, you don't need to remember where that number is. As long as you can look at the other numbers, you will get to it. unless you happen to live in a very small village. There are some of them out there that were built, that are very old, where they used to number the houses in the order of the time when they were built. Can you imagine trying to find a house number there? It's very, very entertaining. Okay, so these kinds of things provide external knowledge. Yes?
But signage doesn't have to be a sign where big letters, Hauptgebäude, for example.
Yeah.
This way,
Yeah.
It could be a street too, where when I see it,
Absolutely, yeah. So definitely, he was saying signage. It doesn't just mean things with letters on them, but also when you see what we call landmarks, particular buildings or corners or a tree or whatever, those things are also often remembered. And the story goes, not sure how much that's backed up, that men versus women remember these kinds of paths differently. Men tend to remember more like sort of directions and names of places and stuff like this, whereas women have a better picture of landmarks to navigate through. But anyway, so that's the difference of knowledge in the world versus knowledge in the head.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.